But first, Janet Heimlich, author of Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. Her book covers all aspects of religious abuse of children, including those that I've already mentioned, and also others, such as corporal punishment, terrorizing children with fearful threats of hellfire, and so on. In all this, we're not going to lose sight of the fact that we're not just wallowing in pity for the victims of abuse. We're specifically concerned with the role of religion in justifying the abuse. We're not dealing with human cruelty per se, we're dealing with the power of religion to make the abusers feel good about what they're doing. Raising welts on a child's body with a whip may be motivated by sheer cruelty, but what's of interest to us here is that it's also motivated, can be justified by biblical quotation. The parent or teacher doing the whipping sincerely believes he's doing good, sincerely believes he's carrying out God's will, hurting the child now in this world in order to save her immortal soul in the next. Or you may give your child nightmares by telling her about boiling in a lake of fire, but you believe you're doing good because you're saving the child from the actuality of that lake of fire after she's dead. Your child may die because you choose to pray rather than call an ambulance, but you're saving the child's soul from the damnation that could result from disobeying God's law and calling the doctor. It's harder to make that kind of case for sincere righteousness in the case of sexual abuse. When a priest tells a child that it's necessary to have sexual relations with him in order to do God's will or to receive the Holy Spirit or something like that, we don't actually think the priest is being sincere. But when the congregation, and maybe his bishop, maybe the church in general, when the congregation rallies around the priest on the grounds that it is unthinkable that a man of God could do such things, therefore the child must be lying, they do think they're being righteous when they rally around the priest. And this really is an example of religious abuse. Even in those cases where the majority of the population accepts the right of the state to step in and protect the child from abuse, say in the case of medical neglect, it is remarkable how many people accept that religion has some kind of special rights. In state after state, religious lobbies have succeeded in winning legislation in favor of a so-called religious exemption. Yes, under normal conditions, of course, if parents deny their child proper medical attention, the state will step in, but not if the parents can plead religious motives. I quote from the law of Massachusetts, just to give one example. There are many others. A child shall not be deemed to be neglected or lack proper physical care for the sole reason that he's being provided remedial treatment by spiritual means alone in accordance with the tenets and practice of a recognized church of religious denomination by a duly accredited practitioner. So there's a religious get-out clause in many states which enables people to shelter behind it and not do their duty by what any decent person would think for their children. I quoted that from Janet Heimlich's book, and she's going to kick off our series of short introductory presentations. Each panelist will speak for a maximum of 10 minutes in order to leave time for discussion at the end, because this is supposed to be a panel discussion. So, Janet Heimlich.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for coming and engaging in this conversation. This is a topic that has consumed the lives of a number of people up here, and we appreciate your interest. A lot of people ask me how I became interested in the topic of religious child maltreatment. It's a term that didn't exist when I started to look into it. In fact, I Googled that term and only one item came up, which was something I had written. So I thought perhaps this is a topic that has not been widely discussed, and maybe we should talk about it. I did not come from a religious household. I understood that we were Jewish, but we had a Christmas tree every year, so that tells you how pious we were. So I myself was not a victim of religious child maltreatment, even though a number of people, will assume that I was, because I took an interest in it. I took an interest as a journalist, as a mother, and someone who cares about the rights of children. More specifically, what got me very much embroiled in this was when I was reading a series of news stories that revolved around high-profile events and crimes. In the spring and summer of 2008, I began to notice kind of one story after another that really drew my attention. The first was a front-page story in the New York Times about this girl. Madeline Newman, or Kara as she was called, died on March 23, 2008 of diabetes. She was 11 years old. Her parents were extremely religious, holding makeshift church services in their little coffee shop in Wisconsin. They were fervent believers in faith healing, and as such hadn't taken Kara to the doctor since she was 3 years old. And so her diabetes was never diagnosed. She suffered for weeks as her bodily organs deteriorated, and she entered into a diabetic coma. Her parents and others did nothing for her regarding medical care, and instead simply prayed over her. Then about a month later, something else drew my attention. On April 3rd, 2008, hundreds of children who were living in the polygamous Mormon sect called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were removed due to allegations that the sect was marrying off young girls to older men. In the end, 11 men were convicted and sent to prison, including the sect's leader, Warren Jeffs, mostly on charges of child sexual abuse. Unbelievably, all of those men and Jeffs still have custodial rights as parents of the dozens and dozens of children they have sired. And FLDS members continue to follow the edicts of Warren Jeffs. And I want to point out that, as Richard said, it is mostly true that child sexual abuse that occurs in religious, among the pious, is usually not does not have to do with doctrines per se. However, there have been some groups, and this is one of them, where they may not call it child sexual abuse, but the idea of actually marrying virgins, and lots of them, is part of their doctrine. After about a week, after the raid on the FLDS, my attention was drawn to this guy. In April of 2008, Pope Benedict XVI, known formally as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, visited the United States for the first time. Also for the first time, he publicly acknowledged the existence of the child sexual abuse scandal. At that point, it had been determined that there were 13,000 people who, as children, had been victimized by priests or other religious leaders, and the church was facing lawsuits totaling $2 billion. When talking to reporters on that visit, the Pope said, "It is difficult for me to understand how it was possible that priests betray in this way their mission." And I was thinking, it's difficult for the Pope to understand how these abuses could have occurred. Really? He oversaw, previously in his old job, the Office of the Doctrine of the Faith. He personally oversaw untold numbers of cases of child sexual abuse. The Catholic Church had been archiving these cases since 400, the year 400. It would seem as though the Pope would have understood exactly how priests could have betrayed in this way their mission. One, they're pedophiles, and two, the Church gave them access to children. So taking all this in, I began to get the idea that there was a distinct connection between religion and child maltreatment. And maltreatment, by the way, includes both abuse and neglect. But I still kept questioning myself, is this something that's really going on today? Is it very serious? How many kids are really being victimized? And then I caught a little blurb in the New York Times. It said that a toddler's remains were found inside a suitcase in Philadelphia, and police said that the child had been starved to death by members of a religious cult. That toddler was Javon Thompson. He was about 16 months old when he was killed. At the trial, it was revealed that the leader of the cult, known as One Mind Ministries, had proclaimed that Javon had a spirit of rebellion, partly because he was not saying amen at mealtimes. Ultimately, 3 of the cult members were convicted of first-degree murder and given long sentences. His mother avoided jail time by testifying against the other cult members, and she was sent to a facility for deprogramming. But as part of the agreement that prosecutors signed with her was that the deal would be off if Javon rose from the dead. So at that point, I decided that I would write a book on this topic. I interviewed dozens of survivors and experts. I read untold numbers of criminal cases and studies, and came to certain conclusions. First, I wanted to define what this is. Religious child maltreatment is child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs, held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. And I want to tag on to something that Richard said, that we're not talking about people that are just simply crazy, that people who are just purely sadistic and that would be abusing or neglecting children regardless of the influences in their lives. Oftentimes, these crimes are perpetrated in tandem with other people. Also, you have people who are on trial who are not found to be criminally insane. They're found to be sane enough to stand trial, and they're often not found guilty or innocent by reason of insanity. What children are at risk? I believe that children raised in religious authoritarian cultures are at the greatest risk for suffering from this form of maltreatment, and that these cultures, whether it be a household or a place of worship or a community, a missionary school, they have 3 defining characteristics. First, the members maintain a strict social hierarchy. Secondly, the members are unusually fearful. And third, they are socially separatist. If you want to understand just how religious authoritarianism harms children, you should study the handiwork of this man. Jim Jones was the leader of the totalitarian cult known as the People's Temple. In 1978, more than 900 members of the group died from drinking or being made to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. Nearly a third of those who died were under the age of 18 and killed by their parents. One way that Jones was able to get parents to do this was by, over a course of time, breaking down parent-child bonds, weakening the family structure. For example, he had children calling him dad, and he had kids reporting on their parents when they disobeyed rules. And this is how religious authoritarianism harms kids. Parents, it's through the parents, who under normal circumstances might very well be using their instincts to do the right thing for their children, to attend to their children's individual needs. But because they are raised in this authoritarian culture, they are denied that autonomy, or they gravitate towards allowing a religious leader or the customs of the group to determine how they're going to raise their children. Cult experts call these parents middle managers. This is not a new phenomenon. While many Christians are quick to point out that there are biblical passages that seem to reveal that the character in the Bible known as Jesus loved children, they won't often steer you to this passage. In Matthew 10, Jesus supposedly says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter is not worthy of me." Just like Jim Jones, the Jesus of the Bible sought to control children by turning them against their parents and weakening family bonds. And you can see the same phenomenon happening in just about every religious organization to some degree or another. The more authoritarian the culture is, the more harm they are going to do to families, and the more children will suffer. And while we're on the subject of parents being middle managers, I wanted to point out that they too have been acting as middle managers for a very long time. The Old Testament has numerous examples, but perhaps this story is the most extreme. I consider Abraham to be the ultimate middle manager parent. In Genesis 22, he thinks God tells him to sacrifice his son, and off he goes to slit Isaac's throat. So what can be done about this? My book contains numerous solutions, but I think the best people to appeal to are parents. I think with a little education, we can get parents to start questioning. Am I raising my child in a religious authoritarian culture? Is my child being exploited? Are they being made to go on protests or proselytize? Think about that the next time a Jehovah's Witness comes to your door with their children in tow. Exploitation, by the way, is a clinically accepted form of child abuse, child emotional or psychological abuse. It's when adults live their lives or their faith through their kids. And it also looks like this. When children are forced to live and breathe the faith, to carry out unpleasant or abusive rituals, they are being religiously, psychologically victimized, and CPS should intervene. Finally, I think we all have to do a better job at recognizing that children's human rights need to be respected, and that includes their right to a healthy, safe, and happy life, the right to intellectual autonomy, the right to ask questions and express doubt so that children are allowed to be the persons that they are. Thanks very much.